Thank you. Can everybody hear me back there okay? Sweet. So yes, this is not my normal classroom attire. I figured since I'm doing a talk on Cyberpunk, I might as well kind of dress the part of the hacker. So what exactly am I going to try to accomplish today? You know, Cyberpunk is one of those terms that, how many of you have heard of Cyberpunk? Okay, can anybody tell me actually what it is? That's one of the problems with Cyberpunk. It's such a kind of a loaded term, especially today, because it's so integrated within our society in terms of the visual aesthetic. You are all familiar with Cyberpunk. You've seen it in movies without even necessarily realizing it, because it's just become such an integral part. So what I want to do today is just kind of talk about what are some of the core tenets, what are some of the core aspects of Cyberpunk. So hopefully I don't confuse you, but you actually leave here today with a little bit better understanding of exactly what Cyberpunk is. If somebody will ask you, what is it? Well, there's two aspects. There's the visual aesthetic of it, the look and feel, the dress, and then there's also kind of the underlying themes, the underlying ideas. So I want to talk about both of those. I'm going to give you kind of an overview, the origins. I'll talk a little bit about that. Now, let me say this is not going to be an all-inclusive talk on Cyberpunk. I'm going to focus primarily on the 80s, which is really where Cyberpunk was born. A lot of people say that Cyberpunk is it really was kind of a byproduct of the 80s. Some people argue that it was born in the 80s and it died in the 80s, at least that core aspect of really what was Cyberpunk, even though we have a lot of examples of it today. So with that being said, let me get started. And the first thing I will tell you about, because if you actually Google Cyberpunk, this is the first thing that's generally going to pop up. It has nothing to do with the Cyberpunk genre per se. How many of you are familiar with Cyberpunk 2077? Have you played it? Have you played the new 2.0 update? Kai, you have a few people? Okay. So yeah, so Cyberpunk 2077 was a game that actually came out about 3 years ago. And like I said, it's just because it's so, if you Google, this is what you're going to get. It is kind of related to Cyberpunk and a lot of the themes, but this is not what we're going to talk about today. So if you thought this was going to be a discussion about the Cyberpunk 2077 game, sorry. Just as a side note, the Cyberpunk on the left, this game was actually based off of a role-playing game that came out, I believe, in 1988 during kind of the height of the Cyberpunk movement. It was a role-playing game. I don't know if anybody in here familiar with the role-playing game of Cyberpunk? A few people? Okay. So yeah, this is not what we're going to talk about. We're actually going to talk about Cyberpunk itself, the genre of Cyberpunk. So first, let's just start with a simple dictionary definition. What is Cyberpunk? How does the dictionary define it? So there's two things to kind of look at, because we kind of have this melding of both cyber, which could be cybernetics, cyber augmentation, but we have this cyber, which is the technology aspect of it, and then the punk aspect of it. So just straight from the Merriam-Webster dictionary, science fiction dealing with future urban societies dominated by computer technology, kind of juxtaposed against this opportunistic computer hacker. And this idea, this high-tech low life, this is essentially the motto of Cyberpunk. This is just a simple definition of Cyberpunk in and of itself. High-tech, low life. And I'll talk about exactly how those two play out together. The rest of this definition in science fiction circles, Cyberpunk is a genre that often features countercultural anti-heroes trapped in a dehumanizing high-tech future. And so you have this kind of dichotomy of the high-tech component of it, the technology. Okay? In the cyberpunk world, these could be, obviously it's artificial intelligence, computer, the beginnings of the cyberspace, the matrix, cyber augmentation. But then that's juxtaposed against the low life, the people who are just trying to make it by in this high-tech society, the outcast of society, the hackers of society, the rebels, the denzians. And so you have this juxtaposition throughout Cyberpunk of this high-tech, low life. Yeah, technology's great, but for most people, they're not able, unless you are rich and wealthy, you are not able to be a part of that high-tech aspect of it. And that's one of the kind of key components of Cyberpunk, which I'll talk about later. So where did the term Cyberpunk actually come from? There was a gentleman by the name of Bruce Bethke who at the time, 1980, he was working in a Radio Shack. How many people in here remember Radio Shack? Okay, yes, great store, loved it. But he was working in a Radio Shack, and they had a demo set up of the TRS-80, which I found an old advertisement for it. There you go, for $600, that could be yours. You have to realize this was the beginning of the digital revolution. You know, home computers really weren't a thing. The first Macintosh didn't come out until 1984. How many of you remember the famous Apple commercial? Yeah, 1984 will not be like 1984. So it really wasn't until the mid-'80s when personal computers kind of started to come about. The internet was not a thing until, you know, the next decade in the 90s. But he was working at Radio Shack, and a group of, as he described them, teen punks came walking in and hacked his demo. And rather than getting upset, he started to think about what is this new generation of kids going to be like? Kids that can grow up with the power to manipulate those computer systems. And so he wrote a short story, aptly named Cyberpunk. I put a quote up there. I'm not going to read the whole quote, but it was basically, he was really curious about, you know, the parents of these new generation of kids who were literally going to grow up speaking computer. How is that going to change that dynamic? And so he wrote a book, or a short story called Cyberpunk, and it's basically a short story about these kids, you know, that are hackers, kind of the outcast, and then one of them sent away to school and they want to come back. But the term cyberpunk itself, this is where it came from. Bethke, the reason I mention him is a lot of times he doesn't get a lot of credit because it was actually in 1984. This was published in 1983, and a year later, in 1984, a critic and editor by the name of Gardner Dozois wrote an article for the Washington Post called Science Fiction in the 80s. And he borrowed this term from Bethke, and the term just stuck. So at this point, we had kind of this idea, this term of cyberpunk. But Bethke is kind of credited with not only kind of coining the term, but also kind of creating that Mohawk hacker punk outcast character of cyberpunk. And so from there, let me actually backtrack a little bit. How many of you are familiar with Philip K. Dick? Okay, even if you do not know who Philip K. Dick is, you may have seen one of his movies. Hollywood loves making movies of Dick's short stories. You know, I put some of the more famous ones up there: Paycheck Next, Adjustment Bureau, Screamers, Man in the High Castle, Minority Report, A Scanner Darkly, Total Recall. How many people have seen Total Recall? The original with Arnold Schwarzenegger, not the remake. And then, of course, Blade Runner, which is kind of the seminal film that would really kind of solidify the look and feel of the cyberpunk movement. Dick is, now, he was writing in the, he was part of this kind of new wave of science fiction writers after the 50s. And so he's not really considered cyberpunk per se. A lot of times he'll be referred to as proto-cyberpunk, but the thing is if you actually do any kind of research on cyberpunk, they're always going to mention Philip K. Dick as kind of being one of those founders of it, even though he was not writing in the traditional sense of cyberpunk. Because what he did is he started to lay some of those seeds that would later go on to form the foundation of the cyberpunk movement of the 80s. And one of his novels in particular, actually, he was doing research for another novel of his, The Man in the High Castle, which was published in 1962. And he was doing research on, anybody read Man in the High Castle or seen? There's actually an Amazon series, really good series, if you have Amazon Prime and you want to check it out. It's kind of a historical science fiction, reworking of, what would have happened if the US and Allies had lost World War II. He was doing research for this novel, and he came across an account of a German soldier who was talking about how the starving children were keeping him up at night. And it was not out of a sense of guilt or remorse. It was a nuisance because he couldn't get a good night's sleep. And this had a profound impact on Dick because it really, he started to think, this person is just not human. I mean, and essentially what happened is this idea led to kind of the foundation for Dick's take on an android. Okay? Basically somebody that resembles a real human being but lacks one critical difference, empathy. Okay? And that's how that was his definition of an android. They're complete, you cannot tell them apart from another human being with the exception of they have no empathy. And so this led to his most famous novel, 1968's Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep, which really introduced the world to some of these beginning, kind of laying the groundwork for some of these ideas that would later go on to form the cyberpunk genre. We have things like, the constant rain, overpopulation, electric billboards, the humanoids. And so even though Dick was not writing during the time of the cyberpunk, he started to lay the groundwork, and especially in the concept of what makes us human. How do we identify as a human being? Because here's the thing, and there's a lot of philosophical questions that come up in Dick's work, especially in this novel, is if a machine, okay, if we cannot distinguish a machine from a human, and by the way, yes, I am human, my shirt, you can see it, but if you cannot make that distinction, then does that make them any less real? Does our perception become reality? And this would be something fundamental to the cyberpunk movement later on, is this blending of the human and machine, the integration of technology. Where does that line end where we're no longer human? If I replace everything with cybernetic implants, am I still human? What's at our core? What distinguishes it? For Dick, it was empathy. There's a lot of stuff. I'm not going to go into details on the novel, but it's a really good, it kind of sets it up. So moving ahead here, like I said before, there are two aspects of cyberpunk. Okay? You have the underlying ideas of cyberpunk, but then you also have the visual aesthetic. This is what most people are familiar with, the look and feel of it. There was a Chilean writer by the name of Alejandro Jodorowsky who was working on a film adaptation of Frank Herbert's Dune. Now, this never got made. There was actually, it went through a lot of the pre-production. I mean, they had hired staff, they had built the sets. And on this movie, the reason I bring this up is because there were two gentlemen who were hired to work on this movie, Dan O'Banion and Mobius. Mobius was a French illustrator, a very famous French artist, French illustrator. Dan O'Banion was he was a screenwriter at the time. And so what happened was, while they were waiting for this movie to basically be made, the two of them got together. O'Banion wrote a short story, and then Mobius came along and said, you know what, let me look at this. Why don't we collaborate and I'll illustrate this? And essentially what happened is they came up with a 16-page comic book that would actually reshape and change science fiction forever. This comic book is still used today. It's still referenced today in terms of the visual look at it, or the look of it. You can actually find this online. I put just a couple, or put the main story plate there, but you can find this online if you just Google The Long Tomorrow. It'll pull up. But it was a two-part. It was originally published in 1976 in Metal Hurlant, and then in the American counterpart of Heavy Metal in 1977. And like I said, it would really set the visual aesthetic of the look and feel of cyberpunk. And this would go on to have a huge influence on a movie that came out in 1982 called Blade Runner. How many of you have seen Blade Runner? Anybody? Okay. So this movie, when you look at cyberpunk, this movie always comes, they always talk about this. They talk about usually Blade Runner and then a novel, Neuromancer, which I'll talk about here in a few minutes. But Blade Runner was directed by Ridley Scott. It was loosely based on Dick's original novel, Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep, which is why, a lot of people, even though Dick wasn't writing during the 80s, they still refer to him as kind of proto-cyberpunk, okay? Because it was pre-cyber, predated, because at this point, even in 82, the cyberpunk genre was not around. It had not actually been solidified yet as terms of kind of an offshoot of science fiction. But what Scott did here is he created a world that would just go on to completely redefine the look and feel of what science fiction is. A lot of the things that we're familiar with now, those dark, gritty streets, the mega cities, mega corporations, skyscrapers that, as far as the eye can see, the juxtaposition of that high tech, the wealthy, the class divide, the streets. So Blade Runner was heavily influential in laying some of the key concepts of, and I will mention this, the Sid Mead, who was the visual designer for Blade Runner, pretty famous in his own right. He went on to create a lot of stuff. But he said that, basically science fiction is, reality ahead of schedule. One of the things that Scott wanted to do in Blade Runner is he did not want to make it, sometimes science fiction is referred to as speculative fiction because it looks far into the future. One of the things with cyberpunk writers is they were writing in the 80s, but they were dealing with the very near future. All of the stories take place, Blade Runner takes place in 2019. Okay? All these stories were taking place 2019, 2020, 2021, the time that we're living in right now. And so one of the things that Scott wanted to do in making Blade Runner is he did not want to make it so futuristic that it looked unreal. He wanted it to look real, something that we could recognize. Yeah, it was still futuristic. It's got flying cars and other things that may not look quite familiar, but it's lived in. It's real. We can recognize it. And so it laid a lot of the kind of visual aspects of what cyberpunk would be. The near future urban dystopia, mega cities, slums, dingy streets, these mega corporations. And a lot of these mega corporations in cyberpunk works, you think about even today where you've got tech companies that wield a tremendous amount of power. That was something that we were talking about back in the 80s with these mega corporations in these stories that literally wielded more power than the governments themselves. So much power that in a lot of these stories, the mega corporations have their own military force. They have their own police force. Now, I want to just, see how much time we got here. I want to show you just real quickly. So this is, I'm not going to show this whole clip, but it shows the visual aspects of Blade Runner. And I want you to at least see this because, like I said, the visual quality is what plays such a huge part in cyberpunk. But you'll notice that even just in that short little clip, you have, again, this kind of separation of the high-tech low-life. If you notice, some of it was very brightly lit. That was actually the Tyrell Corporation, one of the mega corporations, versus the very dingy, grimy bottom of these mega cities, the streets. So it's this kind of this dichotomy of the high-tech and the low-life. Now, there was a gentleman by the name of William Gibson. He actually went and watched Blade Runner in the theater. And he watched about the first 30 minutes of it and ran out in a panic. Because he was working on a story at the time and he was afraid that his story, everybody would think that it was a ripoff of Blade Runner. So he spent the next, actually quite a bit of time, and he rewrote the first 2/3 of the novel 12 times. And essentially what he came up with was Neuromancer. This is the novel that really solidified the cyberpunk genre. When you talk about cyberpunk, when you look at cyberpunk, like I said, you're always going to hear references to Blade Runner and to this one, Neuromancer. A lot of people will refer to Gibson as kind of the godfather of cyberpunk. He himself has said he was not. He did not create anything new. He didn't create a new genre. All he did was he simply took the ideas that had already been percolating there from from this new wave of science fiction writers from the 60s and 70s, and basically solidified everything within this one novel. This novel became an instant hit overnight. It spread globally. Today it's sold over 7 million copies worldwide. It completely took off and really solidified, okay, here is what cyberpunk is. Here's the look and the feel of cyberpunk. But one of the things he did in here, and what a lot of cyberpunk writers were doing, is they were trying to look at how this technology is going to impact our society. Is it going to be a good thing or is it going to be a bad thing? And unlike a lot of other earlier science fiction that was very optimistic, cyberpunk writers were the complete opposite. They were looking at the dangers of this technology on our society. And you have to realize that this was in the 80s, so the internet was not around. Personal computers were not a thing. Gibson actually wrote this on a typewriter. He commented in one of the interviews he was given, he said, this was published 2 weeks before the first Macintosh was released. So they were thinking about all these things before, but what's interesting is how much they actually got right, at least in terms of terminology. William Gibson, came up with the term cyberspace, the Matrix. All these terms, a lot of these writers were coming up with at the time. But again, he was kind of taking a dark perspective of what's going to happen with this technology. And so it provided more of this kind of stark vision of our high-tech future that really separated it from the previous science fiction genres that, like I said, was much more optimistic. And it kind of created this offshoot of the mainstream science fiction, which would then become known as cyberpunk. So what were some of the main themes or some of the main ideas that came about because of cyberpunk? And a lot of these, I'm not going to go into detail on them, but a lot of these really hit at the heart of what cyberpunk was. So when you're asking somebody or somebody says, what exactly is cyberpunk? Well, here's some of the main ideas. Technology is the main source of power over others, and this has to do specifically with information. Information is the new currency. Okay? Now remember, it may sound like I'm talking about today. This is the 80s. Okay? Information is the new currency. Information is power. Okay? Multinational corporations that develop and control that technology wield more power than the governments themselves. The world is a bewildering splatter of culture. Again, kind of this subset where you had the high-tech aspect versus the low-tech aspect, or the low-life aspect. So this novel really, like I said, Gibson didn't create cyberpunk. He just took all the ideas that were already there and turned it into what would become, the singular novel for cyberpunk. It's in essence, if you break down cyberpunk or break down Neuromancer, it's just a heist novel, is all it is. I mean, plain and simple, it's a heist. It's a really good heist. It's interesting. There's a lot of technology, but that's really all it is. Now, I just had to throw this in there because this is the opening line for Neuromancer, and this is one of my just favorite lines. The sky above the port was the color of television tuned to a dead channel. And the reason I wanted to throw this slide in there, how many of you remember because I remember when I was a little kid, and it's not like now where you have 24/7 television. It's like they used to shut the transmitter off at usually like midnight when they played the national anthem, and then if you fell asleep, you'd wake up to like this static on the TV. I remember as a little kid, I was waiting for Saturday mornings. I was waiting for them to come back on so I could watch cartoons when they actually had good cartoons on TV. But anyway, I just had to throw that in there. I wanted to see how many people still remembered when, TV was not 24/7. So what happened after this? A couple years later, in 1986, a gentleman who was also kind of influential in that beginning cyberpunk movement, a gentleman by the name of Bruce Sterling. He wanted to, at this point, he kind of understood, because up until Neuromancer, all these short stories, or all these stories about cyberpunk consisted of just short stories. And so he knew that it was something different from mainstream science fiction. So he wanted to kind of, put something out there that he could say, this is cyberpunk. This is how we define cyberpunk. So he put together an anthology called Mirror Shades. And what most people reference back to this, because honestly the stories that are in there are not the best selection. We won't talk about that, but what most people, the reason they bring this book up is because of the preface. Sterling wrote the preface for this, and what he did in the preface is he finally codified, laid the groundwork for this is cyberpunk. So if you want to know, kind of the technical terminology and all that behind it, read the preface to Mirror Shades. Now, some people will say that by doing this, because one of the things that made cyberpunk, it was kind of cool at the time because it was new, people didn't really understand it. They said one of the problems with this is it killed cyberpunk, because once they put a definition on it, then you could move beyond it. And then in the 90s, you get into proto-cyberpunk and kind of redefining. But this novel itself, and I put this quote up here, and I'm going to read this quote to you simply because realize again, this was in '86, but this sounds like, something today. Technical culture has gotten out of hand. You think about even today, how much technology is, how much time do we spend on our phones? Just how much technology is literally shaping our lives. Technical culture has gotten out of hand. The advances of the sciences are so deeply radical, so disturbing, upsetting, and revolutionary that they can no longer be contained. So we can't even control it anymore. They're surging into culture at large. They're invasive. They're everywhere. The traditional power structures, the traditional institutions have lost control of the pace of change. And again, this was 40 years ago. Think about the world that we're living in today and how much they actually did or did not get right. Now, I want to kind of end off here and talk a little bit about, because again, I can't go into a whole lot of detail on this just because of time, but I do have to, if we're going to talk about cyberpunk, you have to talk about Japanese anime. William Gibson, I put a quote up here by Gibson, he said it best. Japan was, they were cyberpunk and they knew it. And they lived it, they didn't care. They were taking all that technology, integrating it into their society. So, you have to look at the influence that Japanese anime had on not only the cyberpunk movement, but also even in our Western society. Because up until this point, most people, in American culture, we had no idea, really any concept of Japanese anime. We were still thinking that cartoons were, for kids. It really wasn't until, you had, you had Art Spiegelman's Mouse that was published in the early 90s, and then of course you had, what really changed our perception here in the West of comic books was Alan Moore's The Watchmen. A lot of people say that's when comic books grew up, because it really changed our perception that, hey, these are not just for kids. These are dealing with some very deep philosophical, questions about society. So in 1988, now this was actually based on an anime, or on a manga. A lot of times what happens in Japan is they will, are y'all familiar with when I say manga? It's basically their version of comics, okay? So what happens in Japan is a lot of times most animation will start out as a manga, and then if it's popular enough, they will turn it into an anime, okay? And this is what happened with Akira. Came out in 1988. It was it was a manga that had been, I think it started in 82, is when it first came out. But it really, this movie really changed our perception, especially here in the West, of anime. This was kind of the quintessential cyberpunk film. Focusing on, the low-life aspect. You had this dystopian society, the rampant, progress of technology and how that was dehumanizing individuals. And so this movie, one of the things that made this movie so significant is a lot of anime in Japan at the time was very cheaply done. It was just done very quickly. They spent a lot of money on this movie. And it shows, even today, if you watch this, it still holds up. Even today in terms of the animation. And so you had this, and then another one that came out in 1995, that was Ghost in the Shell. Now, there was an American version of this, live action version. Did anybody see that? With Scarlett? Okay. Yeah, it was not, if you're going to watch Ghost in the Shell, watch the anime. It's just not, I won't even talk about the American remake of it. But again, this was based on another manga series, and this one really hit at some of the kind of key concepts of cyberpunk, harkening back to kind of those early ideas that Philip K. Dick had, because this story is all about the integration of technology literally into the human body. And where do you draw the line between what makes us human and not human? What happens when the majority of our body is all, technological augmentations? What defines a human being? So very kind of deep philosophical, hence the name Ghost in the Shell. I won't tell you more than that. I'll let you, if you're interested. So let me just kind of, to wrap this up, give you a summary here of some of the defining characteristics of cyberpunk. Okay. So when we talk about cyberpunk, what actually is cyberpunk? What makes something cyberpunk? And again, there's two aspects to this. There's the visual aesthetic, the look and the feel. And then there are the kind of themes, those underlying tenets of cyberpunk. So some of these we've already talked about. I'm not going to go through them in detail, but the advanced technology, you have these high-tech gadgets, things like virtual reality, artificial intelligence. Now, I didn't mention artificial intelligence. I'm actually going to leave off with a clip on that. But obviously, artificial intelligence played a huge role in cyberpunk. There was actually, even going back before kind of the cyberpunk movement, because like I said, there were a lot of influences leading up to it. There was a movie that came out in 1970 called Colossus, the Forbin Project. Anybody in here ever have any idea? Okay, so yeah, it wasn't a, it was a little known movie, but the premise of that movie was the US government had created an artificial intelligence computer to basically solve the world's problems. Well, the Soviet Union created their own AI to solve the world's problems as well, and these two AIs got together and decided, guess what? We can make better decisions than all of you, so we'll just destroy all of you. And if that doesn't sound, there's obviously James Cameron, Skynet, 1984 Terminator. So you had all this stuff. Like I said, I didn't really talk about artificial intelligence, but obviously it played a big part. The dystopian world, again, just that kind of look and feel of it. These mega corporations, dingy streets, the class divide, hacking, rebel protagonists, the neon lit cities. Anytime you see cyberpunk, there's always these neon lights. And again, it's kind of that juxtaposition between, the high tech and then the low life, because you might be, in 1 minute, you might be in this brightly lit neon shop, and then you walk right next door and you're literally in a drug den with crime and corruption. The underlying themes. So what were some of the things they were trying to, because like I said, ultimately, cyberpunk writers were trying to warn us about something. Okay? What exactly were they trying to warn us about 40 years ago? Okay? Advancements in technology and its impact on society and the individual, the blurring of the lines between man and machine, the intersection of high and low culture, the power dynamics between corporations, governments, and individuals, the exploration of cybernetic enhancements, the use and abuse of information technology, the impact of artificial intelligence, the impact of a network communication system, especially on our own privacy. So a lot of these ideas are things that I think we're, especially in today's society, that we're talking about even today. And I want to kind of end here with, because I think everybody's familiar, even if you're not familiar with any of the cyberpunk writers, I think everybody's familiar with James Cameron, Titanic, and Terminator, Aliens. Okay, so he was doing an interview a couple months ago, and I'm not going to play this whole interview, I just want to play like a minute from it, but listen to what he says at the very beginning, because he's telling us about something he warned us about 40 years ago. And this is in reference, they're talking about artificial intelligence, and the whole conversation was essentially based on, it started because the context of it is the conversation was artificial intelligence and the use of script writing and how that's going to change going forward in Hollywood and all that. But I just want to play this one little clip for you here and what he says at the very beginning. Okay, so, oops, sorry about that. So I put up here, yesterday's science fiction is today's technological reality. So again, what a lot of these cyberpunk writers, you have to realize it was the beginning of the digital revolution. We're so accustomed to technology today. We've grown up with technology. We don't think about it. We don't take, but they were really they took a darker approach to this use of technology and how it would fundamentally possibly reshape not only society, but us as human beings, as individuals. What makes us human? Is the technology, are we somehow going to lose the core aspect of what makes us, a human within society? And so there was, and I didn't go into, in the 90s, of course, what ended up happening, I didn't put this in here, but what ended up happening is once Neuromancer came out, Blade Runner, Neuromancer, and then it was kind of codified with mirror shades. Cyberpunk really took off in the 90s. You had Johnny Mnemonic, just all kinds of movies that Hollywood jumped on board. They wanted to be a part of this. RoboCop, it was just like anything and everything. It literally became part of mainstream society in the 90s. And one of the things that happened with this is that everybody kind of jumped on board with it. Cyberpunk is the cool thing, it's the new thing. So nowadays, one of the problems too is when you're trying to define cyberpunk, there's so many of these derivatives. If you look it up, you have biopunk, steampunk, diesel punk, atom punk. It was like, well, whatever it is, let's just stick punk on it, and that'll be the new thing. So it really kind of got convoluted in terms of what were the core principles of those those early, 80s writers that really set out to define this new technological future that we were going into. And so I actually want to leave you with a question. So I put in here, again, many cyberpunk writers that were trying to warn us about the dangers of this technological futurism. And so my question to you, because throughout history, we've always, there's always been a little bit of fear. Anytime new technology comes along, we've always been fearful of it. How is it going to change society? What's it going to do? So my question is should we be concerned about the dangers of technology on society and humanity? Is this somehow different than prior creations, prior inventions? And, or are we just simply already living in a cyberpunk world? Yeah. All right, that's all I got. So if y'all have any questions.
Thanks for watching. Please like, comment, and subscribe for more content from LSC-Kingwood.